found that we needed to get the word out among owners. And so our lawyers in our firm began volunteering to speak at various groups that contained owners. I recall the very first group I ever spoke to, ever. And I was scared to death because even though I had made jury arguments and the like, I had never before spoken to a group just making a talk. And I spoke to what was then called the National Institute of Municipal Law Officers in Washington, D.C. And at the conclusion of about a 20-minute talk, a gentleman walked up to me. I'll never forget his name. It was Marvin Williams from Meridian, Mississippi. The National Institute of Municipal Law Officers was city attorneys. That was a fancy name for city attorneys. And Marvin Williams was the city attorney of Meridian, and he walked up to me afterward and said, do you work in Mississippi? And of course I said, I work everywhere. Of course, I was working nowhere at the time because I didn't have any clients. But he said, we have a problem and we'd like to talk to you. And they became our first owner client at that time. Subsequent to that, by various connections, by talking with various groups, bar groups, other organizations, we began to build, and the word began to spread that we were doing this kind of thing. And we created the material for a 2-day owners seminar that we put together with the idea that one of the things that owners needed more than anything else was education as to their position, their rights, their obligations in the process. And we didn't see any other source of that out there. So we began doing that. There was a firm that gave seminars from Bellevue, Washington, that we hooked up with, called the Northwest Center for Professional Education. And they began sponsoring seminars around the country for us that we taught, 2-day seminar. And as a result, we began to get our message out. We began to see results, the results we were pleased with, and our practice began to grow in that area. Somewhere along about the early 1990s, we noticed that still there was no central place, a central gathering place, like an association that attracted or really looked to owners in construction. Now, I don't mean by that there were no owners of construction projects who were members of other members of other associations. There were, for example, the NIMLO group that I just mentioned, all the municipal attorneys from around the country. But the purpose of that organization was not construction. It was other matters relating to cities. And of course, the retail side had their own associations, and so did the various businesses and service organizations. The airlines have their own, but they certainly build a lot. They just had nothing that was owner construction oriented. So about 1992 or 3, we began to think about the idea of funding, or I shouldn't say funding, founding a construction owners association that would be solely for the purpose of members of owners that were engaged in construction, both public and private, in this country and in the Caribbean, but in the U.S. essentially, to provide a resource for education, for there to be some collegiality amongst people that otherwise don't know each other exists or have no reason to exchange experiences and exchange situations that they have engaged in, to perhaps in some instances be advocates for positions before local or even nationwide bodies, and to also to interact with these other players in the process, the contractors, the architects, and so on, so that the contractors, as they got together talking about how they would like the procedures to function, could have the enlightened view of the owner segment, who was paying all the bills. And so that the architects, who by this time had, while they had 100-year-old contract documents that they furnished in standard form to the entire industry, and believe me, they were well written and are well written documents, but they are certainly, or were being at that time, written from the perspective of the architect and the design community and the design build community. And there was no one really who was an advocate for the owner's position. And we anticipated that an owner's organization might over time come to do all of these things if there was significant interest. So we looked around to see whether there was anything that was even approximately an organization that might, by virtue of a spinoff, create a subsection or something of that nature that would suffice. And we simply couldn't find anything. There was the round table that was operated by, I believe, the National Chamber of Commerce. There were various organizations that were peripherally involved from time to time in construction, but no one that really nailed it and said, this is our purpose. So we, in my law firm, we kept mulling over the idea of trying to form such an association. But the question becomes then, how do you do it? How do you, we found a difficult time finding clients because of the diversity of the ownership universe. How do you find enough people to create a critical mass that will start an organization? And after a number of conversations about that, we thought we had figured out a way to at least accurately gauge the interest in doing so. And so in 1994, the early part of 1994, we made the decision to make the effort and see what happened.